So this presentation is sort of designed to try to apply some of these ideologies and then add in a few more details about political science concepts as we start looking to comparative politics and international relations. And to do it, we're going to look at Greece and the Eurozone and sort of explain some of the basics of that, but also use this example to sort of teach you a little bit about how political science examines this issue. Basically, what we see in this situation is a classic problem that we have in Europe and Greece right now, and that is the conflict between state sovereignty and neoliberal economics that take place either in a worldwide phenomena or regionally. In this case, it's primarily the Eurozone or the European Union, the European Parliament, and the European Central Bank that alongside the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. So what we see here is Greece, a sovereign state recognized by other sovereign states around the world, part of a regional alliance called the EU, which led them to adopt the euro and the financial principles of the Eurozone, and then down the road having a problem because of that. That undermines or at least challenges the sovereignty of the people of Greece to decide what to do with its country. Now, state sovereignty is defined, and this is a widely used textbook, Philip Shively's Power and Choice and Introduction to Politics. If I wanted you to spend $100 on a textbook, this might be the one that I would have assigned. I think it's $110. That's why I'm trying to do this without you having to buy one. But again, state sovereignty is defined as a political unit that has ultimate authority for its own affairs. So sovereignty means that you get to determine what's happening in your borders. So the United States gets to determine what's happened in its borders, Greece, its borders, Germany, its borders, Nigeria, its borders, and even China, its borders. This became a really important concept, state sovereignty, with the modern concept of nationalism and the nation state and the settling of geographic boundaries that happened beginning in the sort of late 17th century in Europe, and then continuing on and having all sorts of ripples until the 20th century when it sort of began to sort of shake out again. And now we're in a current situation where we have over 200 sovereign states, which is, I believe, more than we've ever had. But again, this idea that there's this need to have a national organization or a structure that has control over its own destiny, and that's what we call state sovereignty. Key aspects of state sovereignty is that the state is the state's principal actor, meaning the one to make the day-to-day decisions as well as the big picture decisions is government. And government is usually understood as a group of people who have the ultimate authority to act on behalf of that state that has the sovereignty. This is also often called something that we refer to as the autonomous state. And the autonomous state basically means important decisions and the resolution of any conflict over what the right thing to do is conducted by that government in that state without interferences from anywhere else. So the institutions of government, through elections in most places, but not all, create public policy, they develop the policy, they implement it, and so it's the government that is the primary decision maker and settling of conflict. Counterbalanced in most cases by what's called civil society. Civil society is an important term used in political science and elsewhere that refers to those sort of non-governmental institutions and organizations that are really quite important. For example, religious organizations, churches, but not just churches, other parts of civil society, including professional associations, unions. These are sort of part of how, we join together in ways not necessarily related to government to try to promote our interest, our passions, our concerns. And so civil society can be used as a counterweight, but ultimately that counterweight only works as it relates to working with the government. And so state sovereignty requires that the government be the center of decision making. Of course, there have been a lot of challenges to state autonomy. In recent events, you've got sort of 20 or 30 different examples, and I'm going to pick two before I get to Greece. The first is Egypt. Egypt came out of the Arab Spring, which occurred initially in Tunisia, right next door. The Arab Spring was sort of a call to end sort of authoritarian rule, often sort of in the form of people called presidents who are supposedly elected with a large, usually 90% or more percentage of the vote in elections that are not really fair or free and don't have much competition. Well, the Arab Spring led to this sort of push for self-determination and democracy. And in Egypt, it was part of what we call the Arab Spring, where they overthrew the government of Hosni Mubarak, who was the successor to Anwar Sadat, the leader of Egypt, who was assassinated, um, because of his position in the Egypt-Israeli peace agreement. So, Mubarak, who comes from a military tradition, had control over the country for somewhere around 30 years. And yes, there were elections periodically, but he would always win with 90 to 95% of the vote. And so there was a movement in 2011 to sort of have a constitution instead of having the less formal sort of pattern of government under Mubarak. And that led to the election of Mohamed Morsi, who was the leader of a party called the Islamic Brotherhood, I believe it's called, and that is essentially a traditionalist, or you might call it a fundamentalist, government religious party. And you have to remember that Mubarak and Sadat were secular. They sort of thought it was important to separate religion from the government, and so they had a secular government. Morsi got elected in 2012, and there was, sort of grave concerns, well placed, for religious minorities and ethnic minorities. And it led to a lot of instability, which then led to protest. Some argue that the military wanted power back and that they sort of orchestrated these protests. There was an ouster of Morsi, and into place came acting President Mansour, and more recently El-Sisi, who is the president right now, and he got reelected. He got elected last year with 97% of the vote, but in an election that was probably not as free or fair or competitive as the 2012 election. And so, you have the problem of state autonomy when you sort of try to change the system. And Egypt is a great example where sort of political movements lead to sort of a desire to change government, but that desire to change government has sort of a counter effect or a backlash effect. And so, the threat of state autonomy in Egypt is essentially El-Sisi. Is El-Sisi a legitimate ruler if he was elected in an election that wasn't seen as being a free and fair and competitive one? Whereas Morsi was elected, won the majority coalition, and implemented all sorts of oppressive policies that were sort of hurting people in the outs, minorities, religious minorities, and ethnic minorities particularly. And so, you have this uncertainty in Egypt about which government is the smarter government. Same is true in Iraq. You see this in Syria right now. There are all sorts of examples. I want to do one more example, and that's the Ukraine before I get to Greece. Now, Ukraine had been its own sort of region or country, and then it became part of the Soviet Union back in the early 20th century. And after, with the fall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine declared its independence in a referendum where over 90% voted to create its own independent republic, and so it established its own state, controlling its own borders. The problem was, since 1991, Ukraine, although it sort of declared its geographic independence and its own government as free from Russia, there's always been this struggle between the advocates for European closeness and the advocates for Russian closeness, because it's in between. European was part of Russia's buffer between itself and the West. It very consciously created that. And so the problem is that Ukrainians are generally divided. In 2004, there was the Orange Revolution and essentially a pro-Russian leader, Leonid Kuchma. He was ousted, and a sort of a new government that was a lot more pro-West, a lot more sort of diligent in in investigating fraud and abuse and corruption, got put into place. But because that government headed, by the way, by Yulia Tymoshenko, one of the first women to lead a post-Soviet republic. She may have actually been the first woman. I think there's one other one that may have preceded her. But anyway, she was more pro-European, and that led to a lot more tension with Russia supporting the other side. And in 2008, we had the global economic crisis. And the global economic crisis is an example of what happens with neoliberal economics. That basically, neoliberal economics demands free markets, which then leads to all sorts of speculation and other practices that lead to booms, but also then lead to busts. And in 2007, 2008, we had probably the most serious global economic crisis since the 1920s and 30s. Actually, not probably, definitely, that there was a worldwide economic crisis and Ukraine got caught up in it. And it started to be affected by the decline in demand for steel, which is one of its primary industries. Russia sort of started flexing its muscles and kind of retaliating. They cut off gas supplies. They raised gas prices. They actually stopped the import of Ukrainian chocolate. There's this major chocolate company in Ukraine. They claim that they had poison in their chocolate, but essentially Russia was retaliating for Ukraine going a little further toward Europe and talking about joining the EU, and Russia doesn't want that, and so they kind of intervened. And in 2002, Yanukovych got elected in the Ukrainian elections, and he was pro-Russian. And what Yanukovych did was, besides jailing Tymoshenko and some others, besides probably being part of the cabal to sort of assassinate a famous journalist who was investigating corruption and others as well. Yanukovych was not particularly popular among a lot of Ukrainians, even though he did eventually get power through an election. Things got worse. Yanukovych moved more toward to Russia, and as a result, tensions grew, and in 2013 there were calls for sort of reform, lots of protests, and in the great old Russian tradition of oppression, yeah, Yanukovych sort of decided that he was going to order the police to fire on protesters, killed 75 or 80 of them, and that led to an enormous outcry, and he had to flee and go to Russia. So you had Yanukovych leaving in 2014, but and a pro-West government sort of taking its place, and Russia then begins to go in and take back the Crimea. Now, I want to show you one of the problems of sort of this idea of states. And this graph, which I got from the Ukrainian Center at Harvard, this sort of is a diagram of the Ukraine, and it's divided, the color codes are the percentage of Russian nationals in a particular province in the Ukraine. And so if you look to the west, you see 2.4%, 3.6. That those regions actually are very Roman Catholic. They were ruled for a long time by Poland. They're part of Ukraine now, but there's very little Russian influence. And then the center part, which is a little more gray, and then the lighter blue, is sort of the original Ukrainian sort of nation before it became a state. And so you see those numbers are pretty low. And so there are very small percentages of Russian nationals. But then when you go to the to the east, and you see 25.6, 39, 38, and then all the way to the south, Crimea, which again was for many years Russian and then Soviet, you see 58.3%. The problem is that the Ukraine has this dilemma where they have a very large percentage of Russian nationals in parts of their country, and that has given Russia a foothold and essentially a point of legitimacy, saying, "Hey, look, these people." Are really Russian, and particularly in Crimea, where the Russians almost certainly sort of staged a referendum where the people of Crimea voted to become part of Russia and declare its own independence, actually. And so there's been this border conflict over and out those blue regions. So sometimes the threat to statehood is a function of the boundaries. If you see here, Ukraine, one of their problems really is that to the west, they're much more European, and to the right, they're much more Russian. European, Russia's in Europe, at least part of it. And so, the problem is these boundaries were really creating a problem. Well, I raise that because, I'm going to talk about neoliberal economics, but that's not the only source of tension for statehood. And statehood actually sort of leads to all sorts of unintended conflicts. And these are just two examples. Now I want to talk a little bit about neoliberal economics. Now, we talked about neoliberalism in politics. They're similar but not exactly the same. But let's do neoliberal economics. And most critics of neoliberal economics see it as a direct threat to state sovereignty. Neoliberal economics started around, late 70s, early 80s, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, New Zealand, the government of New Zealand, but, also the rise of computer technology that allowed for electronic transfer of money, so investors could actually move money very quickly. These plus the ideology espoused by Milton Friedman, particularly, and Friedrich Hayek, sort of led to this sort of call for a neoliberal approach to economic systems. The focus is on free trade. And in doing so, neoliberal economics seeks to dismantle barriers like tariffs and regulations on business and business practices, including safety regulations and environmental regulations and water regulations, certain laws and standards that may interfere with the free flow of capital. to, across borders. One of the main goals of neoliberal economics is to allow money to flow wherever money wants to flow. Thomas Friedman, the columnist for the New York Times, many years ago, dubbed this the electronic herd, meaning that there are people who are investors and they have money and they tend to move together. And so if they move to a country, they tend to all move to a country. If they move away from a country, they tend to all move away from the country. Part of neoliberal economics says you have to downsize government. The way you do that is you privatize services. And so instead of having government spend money on it, you basically have um, private companies providing things like transportation, medical or health insurance, all sorts of other aspects of the economy. It seeks to privatize as much as possible. It also sort of calls for what's called fiscal constraint. Now, fiscal constraint on the part of governments is a very, very important element of the Greek situation. So neoliberal economics is seen as a threat to state sovereignty for several reasons, and here are the main ones. The first is that the use of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank has generally been to force governmental reforms to break down trade barriers. Trade barriers basically are protecting your own industry by charging a lot of money as a tariff for anybody trying to send certain things into your country. And so, free trade, the North American Free Trade, the sort of World Trade Organization, the current Pacific Trade Agreement, these are all examples of trying to sort of force government reforms, and they generally are reforms that are present in poorer countries. The second thing is that regional economic development efforts, the European sort of zone, but there's a regional bank for everything else, focused on expanding free trade, opening markets, and liberalizing economic systems in countries that didn't have a whole lot of resources and needed them. And so as a condition of getting loans, for example, a country had to liberalize, meaning they had to get rid of these barriers and they had to increase the free flow of capital and trade. Because again, free market was seen as the best in neoliberal economics. What it also led to was a flow of jobs to poorer countries away from wealthier countries. And you're probably not old enough to remember NAFTA, which happened in the 90s, and all of the furniture sort of manufacturing that used to be down in the Carolinas is now essentially done in China, except for one or two companies. And often, it's cheaper for a U.S. company to ship furniture across the Pacific 2 or 3 times at various stages in the finishing process, because labor is so cheap in China and Vietnam and other places when compared to the United States. So what's happened is a lot of the jobs to manufacture things have been moved to these developing nations, in part because of the free trade barriers that sort of, the barriers to free trade that have been broken down. But it's also meant that the higher paying jobs in the developed countries tend to flow to lower paying jobs, because of course you want to increase the amount of money that you make. The way to do that is to lower your costs. And it particularly hit those countries in the middle, like Greece. Greece is not a wealthy country, but it's not a poor country. It's somewhere in the middle. And the main sort of one of the most important criticisms that's been launched at neoliberal economics is it exacerbates rising inequality, because if you have a completely free market, well, the people who hold the capital can dictate the terms. And so there's almost a forced relationship between the people who have the money and the people who need the money. So the investors can dictate to the people taking out loans, or the countries taking out loans, and that means that the rich can sort of dominate those terms, and the poor actually have to pay more for credit than the wealthy. And the reality right now everywhere is, the lowest interest rates always go to the people with the most money, and vice versa. So let's look at Greece, just real quick. Greece in 1981 joined the European Union, which was sort of the desire to create a one sort of collaborative system of government while maintaining state sovereignty of the nation states of Europe. And so it was an early member of the European Union. In 2001, it adopted the euro. When the euro came out, sometime around then, and it led to strong growth in that year. It was a period of economic growth in general in Europe, but adopting the euro meant that they were getting rid of the drachma, which meant that they no longer had 100% control over the value of their money, but instead were part of a larger pool. And initially that worked out. Through the encouragement of the IMF and the Eurozone, Greece put a bid in for the Olympics, got it, but they had to build infrastructure. And so, to modernize the infrastructure for the Olympics, a lot of banks, a lot of countries, and the IMF started loaning money to Greece, a lot of money. All was fine and dandy in 2004. The Olympics were beautiful, and things seemed to work out. But the 2007-2008 financial crisis basically put a stranglehold on money. And we saw worldwide economic deflation and negative growth, meaning economies were contracting. When an economy contracts, government doesn't have the money that it normally would have. It has less money, and deficits go up. And so Greece's annual budget deficit kept going up. That's a problem because as part of the European Union, they had agreed to something called the Stability and Growth Pact. And that basically said, okay, your government budget deficits for any given year can't be more than 3%. Well, the economic crisis combined with the heavy debt load that they had taken on right at the wrong time basically meant that Greece had a deficit at about 12%, which is 4 times the agreed amount. Well, that means that the credit rating drops. If you're spending a lot more than you're supposed to and that you've agreed to under the terms of a bunch of loans and all these agreements, then that means the credit agencies are going to downgrade your credit. And that's what happened 2009 all the way through 2013, that there were a series of credit downgradings. Now, the credit downgrading means the bonds that you have to sell to raise money to pay for the capital improvements, but also sometimes debt restructuring, the interest rate you have to charge goes up. So if you go from a AAA to a B, which is essentially what happened over a period of a couple years, you're talking about tripling the interest rate. And so Greece not only couldn't pay what it owed, but it owed more because its credit rating went down. And it's a spiral. And it went into a death spiral. And between 2010 and 2013, I believe there were 7 austerity packages passed, meaning the parliament passed packages at the demand and with the sort of conditions of the IMF and the Eurozone. 7 times they decided to reduce government spending, lay off workers, change pension structures, and essentially what they were doing is they were providing their citizens less of what they had been. Yet it didn't stop the downgrading. And there were 2 bailouts from the IMF that occurred during this period. And I say maybe 3 because that's what we're waiting on right now, is whether or not the IMF is going to bail them out for a 3rd time. But a lot of this comes from Greece's decision to enter into the euro. And Greece's decision, with the urgings and the encouragement of banks and the IMF and the Eurozone, to borrow money. So those 2 things together created a real problem for Greece. The current standoff, basically, is one that's really important for political science because the question is, what is the primary authority structure of government, ideally? And that is, should it be democracy? Should it be the representative democracy, meaning parliament, or should it be the demands of those who control the economic purse strings? And so we had this situation where the Eurozone, led by Germany, but they're not the only ones, in some ways they're not the most severe ones, demanding that the Greek government do something. The Greek government putting it to the vote, and the people saying no. We've done 7 different austerity packages. We're not doing more. But then yesterday, July 10th, the Greek parliament agreeing to most of the provisions of the bailout as long as there's a little bit of debt forgiveness, meaning they want to pay those debt back. And so this current standoff is really a question of who really should control the destiny of an individual state. Should it be the state itself? Should it be the external financial pressures, or should it be the people? And those are the three sort of balancing acts that or the three things that have to be balanced when you think about who ultimately should control Greece. Now, this was really, really brief, and I know it's a half an hour. But that, hopefully this gives you some background. If not, ask questions, and I apologize for not being clear enough.